The rain drummed against the windows of the Jade Community Center like impatient fingers, each drop a reminder that October in Portland meant 6 months of gray skies ahead. Zara Williams pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching the empty playground where children should have been laughing. Instead, puddles reflected the dim streetlights of Southeast Division, the kind of neighborhood where hope came in small doses and dreams required careful rationing. I wonder where you're watching this from tonight. Are you somewhere warm and safe, perhaps curled up with a cup of tea while the rain falls outside your window too? There's something about storms that makes us all feel more connected, doesn't it? The same clouds that hover over my Portland sky might be bringing rain to your corner of the world as well. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I'd love to know how far this story travels. At 26, Zara had learned that heroism wasn't about grand gestures, but about showing up every day to a job that paid barely enough to cover her studio apartment rent. She unlocked the center's front door with hands that bore the calluses of someone who moved furniture, scrubbed floors, and hugged children who needed to believe someone cared. The community center served families who lived in the margins, immigrants and refugees who spoke hope in a dozen languages while their children learned to dream in English. Her phone buzzed with a text from her landlord about next month's rent increase. Another $50 she didn't have. Another problem that would require creative solutions involving ramen dinners and skipped lunches. She tucked the phone away and focused on what she could control. Tonight's youth program had been canceled due to the storm, which meant she could catch up on grant applications. The center needed new computers, after-school supplies, funding for the elderly Korean women who gathered every Thursday to share stories and kimchi. The emergency exit alarm shrieked through the building. Zara's blood went cold. The back alley door hadn't been opened in months. She grabbed the baseball bat they kept behind the reception desk and moved toward the sound, her sneakers silent on the worn linoleum. Through the narrow window in the emergency door, she saw shadows moving in the alley's amber glow. 2 men in dark coats stood over something small and trembling. A child. The boy couldn't have been older than 8, his small frame dwarfed by what looked like an expensive school uniform. His black hair was plastered against his head by rain, and even from her vantage point, Zara could see the terror in his posture. He was pressed against the brick wall like a cornered animal while the men loomed over him, their voices low and threatening. One of them grabbed the child's arm. Zara didn't think. She slammed through the door, bat raised, voice cutting through the storm like a blade. "Stop! Let him go." The men turned toward her with the casual menace of predators interrupted during a hunt. The taller one had a scar running from his left temple to his jaw, a mark that spoke of violence survived. His companion was built like a linebacker, hands that could crush windpipes hidden inside leather gloves. The scarred man smiled. "Lady, walk away. This doesn't concern you." "Everything about this concerns me," Zara said, stepping protectively in front of the boy. She felt his small hand clutch the back of her jacket, his breathing rapid and shallow against her spine. "This is private property, and you're terrorizing a child." She pulled out her phone with her free hand, thumb hovering over 911. The linebacker took a step forward, and she raised the bat higher. "I'm calling the police right now." The scarred man's smile disappeared. He said something sharp in what sounded like Korean, and his partner's hand moved toward his coat. Zara's fingers stabbed the call button as she swung the bat in a warning arc. She had exactly 90 seconds before help arrived, maybe less if the patrol car was already in the area. Behind her, the boy whispered something in Korean. His voice was cultured, precise, even in fear. These weren't street thugs picking on a random kid. This was something else entirely, something that made her skin crawl with the certainty that she was way out of her depth. The pepper spray was in her jacket pocket. She'd carried it for 3 years and never used it, but her fingers found the small canister now. The boy's grip on her jacket tightened as the 2 men exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Sirens wailed in the distance. The scar man spat something vicious in Korean and jerked his head toward the street. His partner looked ready to argue, but the sirens were growing louder. They melted into the shadows between buildings with the fluid grace of men who knew how to disappear. Zara kept the bat raised until the police car's red and blue lights painted the alley walls in urgent color. Only then did she turn to face the boy she'd protected. He was beautiful in the way that expensive things were beautiful, his features delicate but strong, his dark eyes holding intelligence that seemed far too old for his age. His uniform was indeed costly, the kind of pristine wool and press cotton that spoke of private schools and trust funds. But it was his stillness that struck her most, the way he stood perfectly straight despite the trauma, as if proper posture could armor him against the world's cruelties. "Are you hurt?" she asked gently, kneeling to his level. The boy shook his head, but his eyes never left her face. She realized he was memorizing her features with the intensity of someone who understood the importance of remembering faces. "What's your name?" She tried in English, then attempted the few Korean words she'd picked up from the elderly women at the center. "Iriam. Your name?" His response was barely a whisper. "Jean." The police officer was young, earnest, overwhelmed by the language barrier and the boy's expensive appearance. Zara found herself translating what little she could, explaining about the men, the threats, the way Jean had been cornered like prey. The officer took notes and called for a translator, but Jean only spoke to Zara, his English limited but his trust absolute. As they waited in the community center's warmth, Jean sat beside her with the formal posture of someone raised in a world where every gesture mattered. His small hand found hers, and she felt the slight tremor that betrayed his carefully controlled composure. She had no way of knowing that across the city, phones were ringing in rooms where decisions were made in whispers and blood. That the boy beside her was not just any child, but the heir to an empire built in shadows, the precious son of a man who commanded loyalty through fear and respect in equal measure. She had no way of knowing that by saving Jean. She had painted a target on her own back and guaranteed that her quiet life of grant applications and community service was about to collide with a world where protection came at prices she couldn't imagine. All she knew was that a child had needed help, and she had been there to give it. The rest would unfold like fate wrapped in expensive silk and edged with steel. The black sedans arrived like a funeral procession, sleek and silent despite their obvious power. Zara watched through the community center's front window as three identical vehicles arranged themselves with military precision along the curb. No license plates she could see, windows tinted dark enough to hide secrets, chrome that gleamed despite the persistent drizzle. Men emerged from the cars with the fluid coordination of a well-rehearsed dance. They wore expensive suits that couldn't quite disguise the bulk of concealed weapons, earpieces that whispered constant updates, eyes that cataloged every shadow and exit. These weren't bodyguards. These were soldiers dressed for polite society. The police officer who had taken their statement straightened unconsciously, his hand drifting toward his radio. Even he could sense the shift in atmospheric pressure that accompanied true power. The last car's rear door opened, and time seemed slow. Minjun Choi stepped onto the sidewalk like he owned not just the street, but the entire city block. He was tall for a Korean man, perhaps 6 feet, with the kind of presence that made space itself reorganize around him. His charcoal suit was cut by someone who understood that clothing could be armor, every line tailored to emphasize the controlled strength beneath. His black hair was swept back from a face that belonged to museums, all sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that missed nothing. But it was his stillness that truly unsettled. He didn't hurry or gesture or waste movement. He simply existed in a state of coiled readiness, like a blade waiting in its sheath. The police officer was suddenly very interested in his paperwork. Jean had been dozing against Zara's shoulder, exhausted by trauma and adrenaline. But the moment the car doors opened, he went rigid, not with fear now, but with something more complex. Recognition mixed with complicated emotions she couldn't parse. "Appa," Jean whispered, and Zara felt rather than saw the boy's conflict between relief and resignation. The center's front door opened without anyone touching it. 2 of the suited men flanked the entrance while their boss stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of expensive cologne and barely leashed danger. His gaze swept the room once, cataloging threats and exits with professional efficiency, before settling on the small tableau of woman and child. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, Minjun Choi simply stared. Zara found herself unable to look away from eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed defenses. This was what apex predators looked like in human form, she realized. Beautiful, deadly, and absolutely without mercy for anything that threatened what belonged to them. But when those dark eyes shifted to his son, something fundamental changed in their depths. "Gene," he said, and his voice was like aged whiskey, smooth and dark with undertones that could burn. "Are you hurt?" The boy shook his head but made no move to leave Zara's side. Instead, he pressed closer to her warmth, his small hand finding hers with desperate trust. She felt Minjun's attention sharpen like a blade finding its target. "Who are you?" he asked her, and though his tone remained polite, she heard the steel beneath silk. "Zara Williams. I work here. I heard the commotion and intervened. You put yourself in danger for a stranger's child." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. Any decent person would have done the same thing. The police officer cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, we've taken statements and filed a report. The perpetrators fled when backup arrived, but we have descriptions and we're investigating." Minjun's gaze never left Zara's face. "Were they armed?" She nodded. "One had his hand inside his coat when I threatened to call you. They spoke Korean to each other, something angry when Gene spoke to me. What did my son say to you?" "Nothing important. He told me his name. He was frightened, but she was lying, and somehow he knew it." Gene had whispered something else as the men retreated, something that had made them spit curses before disappearing. She just couldn't translate the words, only the urgency in the child's voice. Minjun stepped closer, and Zara became acutely aware of how he seemed to absorb all the light in the room. This close, she could see the faint scar along his jawline, the way his suit jacket was tailored to accommodate a shoulder holster, the gold signet ring that caught the fluorescent lighting. "My son appears attached to you," he observed with clinical precision. It was true. Gene had wrapped both arms around her waist now, his face buried against her side like she was the only safe harbor in a storm. She could feel his trembling, the careful control beginning to crack now that his father had arrived. "He's been through trauma," she said gently. "Children need comfort after frightening experiences." "Yes, they do." Something in his tone made her look up sharply. There was a story there, pain carefully buried beneath layers of control and expensive tailoring. This man understood trauma intimately, both giving and receiving it. "Officer Park will escort you home safely," Minjun told his son in English, clearly for her benefit. But Jin's grip on Zara only tightened. "I want to stay with her," the boy said in careful English, each word precisely pronounced. "She saved me, Appa." She was brave. The admission hung in the air like incense in a temple, heavy with significance. Minjun's expression didn't change, but Zara sensed something shifting behind those dark eyes, calculations being made and discarded. He knelt before his son with fluid grace, bringing himself to the child's eye level. In Korean, he spoke gently, his voice carrying warmth she hadn't heard before. Gene responded in the same language, his tone earnest and pleading. Zara found herself studying the man's hands as he cupped his son's face. They were elegant but scarred, with calluses that spoke of weapons training and violence survived. Yet his touch was infinitely gentle, like he was handling spun glass instead of an 8-year-old boy. When Minjun rose, his attention returned to her with laser focus. "My son has had difficulty connecting with people since his mother died 2 years ago. He rarely speaks English with strangers, never shows affection to anyone outside immediate family. Yet here he is, clinging to a woman he met 20 minutes ago. I'm good with children. It's part of my job." "Your job." He said it like he was tasting the words. "What exactly do you do here, Miss Williams?" "Community outreach. Youth programs, elderly services, immigrant family support. We help people who fall through the cracks." "And you live where?" The question was casual enough, but something in his tone made her defensive. "Why does that matter?" "Because my son has requested that you come home with us tonight. He's afraid those men will return for you." Zara's blood went cold. That possibility hadn't occurred to her, but looking at Minjun's face, she realized it should have. These hadn't been random criminals. They'd been hunting his child specifically, which meant they knew exactly who had interfered with their plans. I appreciate the concern, but I'll be fine. The police know what happened. Miss Williams. His voice was soft as velvet and twice as dangerous. Those men work for people who view police reports as mild inconveniences. They will come for you, if not tonight, then tomorrow. Your name is now in their files, your face remembered, your daily routine cataloged. The only question is whether you'll accept my protection or force me to provide it without your consent. The threat was delivered with such polite courtesy that it took her a moment to process its meaning. This wasn't a request. This was inevitability wrapped in expensive manners. You're kidnapping me. I'm offering you employment. Gene requires a tutor and caregiver, someone who can help him process his trauma and regain his confidence. You have clearly demonstrated both competence and courage. The position includes room and board at our family compound, competitive salary, and most importantly, protection from the consequences of your heroism tonight. Jean looked up at her with dark eyes full of hope. Please, Miss Zara, I don't want them to hurt you because you saved me. The child's English was better than she'd expected, his concern genuine. She realized that in trying to protect him, she'd inherited his dangers. This beautiful, terrifying man was offering her a choice between the cage and the wolves. I need time to think. Of course. You have until my son finishes his hot chocolate. One of the suited men materialized beside her with a steaming cup and a small mountain of marshmallows. Jean accepted it with solemn thanks, then proceeded to drink with the deliberate slowness of someone buying time. Minjun watched his son with an expression that revealed nothing and everything. This man would burn the world to keep his child safe, she realized. The fact that he was willing to negotiate at all was probably a courtesy she shouldn't test. The employment contract appeared in her hands with magic trick efficiency, produced by another suited man who seemed to anticipate his boss's needs. The terms were generous enough to make her dizzy. Health insurance, salary that tripled her community center wages, private quarters, and protection services that would make the Secret Service jealous. At the bottom of the page, Minjun's signature waited in black ink like a challenge. She signed her name with fingers that barely trembled and felt the golden cage door swing shut with the softest possible click. Welcome to the family, Miss Williams, Minjun said, and his smile was beautiful and terrible as winter moonlight. The Choi family compound existed in a different universe than the rest of Portland, separated by more than just the wrought iron gates and discreet security checkpoints. Zara's studio apartment could have fit inside the foyer's marble expanse 3 times over, and probably it cost less than the single crystal chandelier that cast rainbow prisms across walls lined with Korean artifacts and contemporary art. Everything whispered of money spent with exquisite taste rather than flashy display. The Persian rugs were museum quality, the furniture a blend of traditional Korean craftsmanship and modern Italian design. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of meticulously maintained gardens where ancient cherry trees stood like sentinels among precisely trimmed hedges. But it was the silence that unnerved her most, not the absence of sound, but the careful orchestration of it. Footsteps muffled by thick carpets, conversations conducted in hushed tones. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to tick with deliberate discretion. She was given a suite on the 2nd floor that was larger than her entire previous living space. The bedroom featured a king-sized bed dressed in linens that probably cost more than her monthly salary, while the sitting area included a desk positioned near windows that overlooked the gardens. Her bathroom contained a soaking tub carved from single piece of granite and fixtures that belonged in luxury hotels. The message was clear. She was not staffed to be housed in servants' quarters, but something else entirely. Something that made her skin prickle with awareness of being watched, evaluated, categorized. Jin's room was down the hall, close enough that she could hear if he called out, but far enough to maintain proper boundaries. Or so she thought until the first night, when his screams shattered the compound's careful quiet like glass breaking. She found him tangled in expensive sheets, small body rigid with terror as he fought invisible attackers in his sleep. His Korean was too rapid for her limited vocabulary, but the fear needed no translation. She gathered him against her chest, murmuring nonsense words of comfort while he sobbed against her shoulder. It was then she noticed the figure in the doorway. Minjun stood perfectly still in charcoal pajamas and a silk robe that somehow managed to make sleepwear look like armor. His dark hair was tousled for the first time since she'd met him, but his eyes were laser-focused on the scene before him. He didn't speak, didn't approach, just watched his son find comfort in a stranger's arms. When Jin's breathing finally even into exhausted sleep, Minjun spoke quietly in Korean. The words sounded like a question, gentle and concerned. He asked if the bad men were coming back. Zara whispered, careful not to wake the child. I told him he's safe now, that you won't let anyone hurt him. Minjun stepped into the room with the silent grace of a predator, but his touch when he smoothed his son's dark hair was infinitely tender. He hasn't slept through the night since the incident 3 months ago. Before tonight, he would only accept comfort from me or his grandmother. 3 months. The attack in the alley hadn't been the beginning, but the culmination of something longer and more sinister. She adjusted her hold on Jean, protective instincts flaring. What happened 3 months ago? His expression shuttered closed like blast doors slamming shut. Business complications. Nothing that concerns you. But clearly it concerned Jean, and Jean was now her responsibility. She met Minjun's gaze with steady determination. If I'm going to help him heal, I need to understand what broke him. For a moment, she thought he might answer. Something flickered in those dark eyes, a vulnerability quickly suppressed. Then Jean stirred against her chest, and the moment passed. We'll discuss this later, Miss Williams. Jean should sleep in his own bed. He's fine where he is. Moving him now will only traumatize him further. The argument that followed was conducted in whispers over the child's sleeping form, a careful battle of wills between her expertise and his paternal authority. In the end, practical necessity won. Jean slept peacefully in her arms until dawn, and Minjun spent the night in the chair beside them, watching over both with sleepless vigilance. The next morning brought the first crack in the compound's formal protocols. Jean refused to eat the elaborate Korean breakfast prepared by the kitchen staff, pushing around banchan and ignoring the perfectly prepared rice. Zara watched him for exactly 3 minutes before standing and heading toward the kitchen. What are you doing? Minjun asked, appearing behind her with the silent efficiency of a ghost. Making him something he'll actually eat. The kitchen staff looked scandalized when she began opening cabinets and investigating the contents of what was clearly their sacred domain. But Jean perked up when she started mixing pancake batter from scratch, adding vanilla and a touch of cinnamon that filled the space with homely warmth. Jean sat on a stool beside her, measuring ingredients with scientific precision while she told him stories about her grandmother's Sunday morning traditions. His English improved dramatically when he was focused on something other than his fears, and she realized that much of his silence came from perfectionist anxiety rather than inability. Minjun watched from the doorway as his son laughed for the first time in months, Flour dusting his expensive pajamas while he flipped a pancake that landed perfectly golden. The man's expression was unreadable, but something in his posture suggested he was memorizing every detail of the domestic scene. The household staff began to orbit around her like planets, finding a new gravitational center. Mrs. Kim, the elderly housekeeper, brought her tea without being asked. The gardener showed her which herbs she could harvest for cooking. Even the stern-faced security team nodded politely when she passed, their automatic deference suggesting orders from above. 3 days into her residency, Minjun appeared in Jin's study room during afternoon lessons. She was teaching the boy to draw, his small hands carefully shading a picture of the cherry trees outside his window. His art teacher says he has no imagination, Minjun observed quietly. His art teacher probably has him copying geometric patterns instead of letting him express what's in his heart. Jean, show your father what you drew yesterday. The boy produced a series of sketches that took her breath away. Dragons soaring through storm clouds, warriors protecting villages, heroes saving people from darkness. Each drawing told a story of courage triumphing over fear, hope defeating despair. Minjun studied the artwork with the intensity he probably brought to business contracts. When he looked up, his eyes held something she'd never seen before. Gratitude mixed with something more complex, more dangerous. "You see him," he said simply. "Not what he should be, but who he is. He's not broken, Mr. Choi. He's just scared. There's a difference." Minjun was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the same intensity he'd brought to Jin's drawings. She realized this was the first time she'd seen him without his perfect armor in place. Exhaustion shadowed his eyes, and the weight of protecting everyone he loved had carved lines around his mouth that made him look older than his 32 years. "Call me Minjun," he said finally, "and perhaps you could join me for dinner tonight. After Jin is asleep, we should discuss his progress." The invitation felt like stepping onto a tightrope stretched over an abyss. But Jin looked up from his drawing with hopeful eyes, and she realized that the boy's healing was tangled up with whatever was growing between his father and the woman who'd saved them both. "I'd like that," she said, and watched Minjun's controlled expression soften into something almost resembling a smile. The private dining room felt intimate despite its elegant proportions, lit by candles that cast dancing shadows across walls lined with what looked like priceless Korean artifacts. Minjun had changed from his business attire into a charcoal cashmere sweater that somehow made him appear both more approachable and more dangerous, like a blade wrapped in silk. Zara had chosen her clothing carefully, settling on a simple black dress that was professional enough for a business dinner, yet feminine enough to acknowledge the undercurrent of something more personal flowing between them. She found it hanging in her closet that morning, perfectly sized, along with shoes and accessories that suggested someone had done very thorough research into her measurements and preferences. The meal was a revelation. Korean dishes she'd never tasted paired with wine that probably cost more than her monthly salary. Each course designed to complement the last in a symphony of flavors that spoke of a chef who understood food as art. But it was watching Minjun eat that fascinated her. His movements were precise and graceful, every gesture economical and purposeful. Even the way he held his chopsticks revealed layers of cultural training and personal discipline that ran bone deep. "You're staring," he observed without looking up from his bulgogi. "I am studying. There's a difference." His mouth curved slightly at one corner. "What conclusions are you reaching? That you're a man who was taught that every action has consequences, every movement reveals character, and relaxation is a luxury you can't afford." The chopsticks paused halfway to his mouth. "That's remarkably perceptive for someone who's known me less than a week." Jean told me about his grandmother's lessons on proper behavior, how every meal is a test, every interaction a reflection on family honor. He's 8 years old, and he sits straighter than most adults. Minjun set down his chopsticks with careful precision. "My mother believes that discipline creates strength, that structure provides security. Given our circumstances, she's not wrong. But Gene isn't just your son. He's also a little boy who needs to make mistakes, get dirty, laugh too loud. Right now he's so focused on being perfect that he's forgotten how to be happy." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down between them. Minjun's expression didn't change, but she sensed the sudden tension in his stillness. "You think I'm too rigid with him. I think you're terrified of losing him the way you lost his mother. So you're trying to control every variable, eliminate every risk. But you can't protect him from life itself." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Minjun's dark eyes had gone completely unreadable, and Zara wondered if she'd pushed too far too fast. "His wife died in a car accident," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "They were coming home from Jin's school play. A drunk driver ran a red light and turned my family into a statistic." The pain in his words was so carefully buried that it hit her like a physical blow. She reached across the table without thinking, her fingers covering his where they rested beside his wine glass. "I'm sorry. I can't imagine losing someone that way." For 3 months afterward, Jean wouldn't speak. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped being the bright, curious child he'd been before. The doctor said it was trauma. That time would heal him. But time just taught him to be afraid of everything beyond these walls. His hand turned palm up beneath hers, their fingers intertwining with natural ease. The simple contact sent electricity up her arm that had nothing to do with sympathy and everything to do with the dangerous attraction building between them. "So you built him a fortress?" "I built him a prison." He said it so quietly she almost missed the words. "The difference is becoming clear to me." She studied his profile as he stared into his wine glass, noting the way candlelight caught the scar along his jawline, the exhaustion he couldn't quite hide behind perfect control. "Tell me about her. What was she like?" Minjun was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he reached into his jacket and withdrew a small photograph, placing it on the table between them with reverent care. The woman in the picture was luminous, her smile bright enough to power the city. She had Jin's delicate features refined into adult beauty, her arm wrapped around a younger Minjun who looked almost unrecognizable in his unguarded happiness. Her name was Sujin. She was a pediatric nurse who believed that laughter was the best medicine and that rules were meant to be broken in service of joy. She would have loved you for making Jean smile again. The admission was so unexpected, so raw with honesty, that Zara felt tears prick her eyes. This glimpse of the man he'd been before tragedy reshaped him was devastating in its contrast to the controlled fortress he'd become. "She sounds wonderful. She was everything I wasn't. Spontaneous where I was planned, warm where I was reserved, trusting where I was suspicious." Jean inherited her capacity for joy along with her features. "And you've been trying to protect that joy by hiding it away." His fingers tightened around hers. Every threat assessment suggested that happiness makes people careless, that emotional openness creates vulnerabilities enemies can exploit. "I forgot that happiness also makes life worth protecting." The conversation turned to lighter topics as dinner progressed, but the undercurrent of something fundamental shifting between them colored every exchange. Minjun asked about her work at the community center, her family, her dreams beyond Portland's gray skies. She found herself telling him about her grandmother's Korean War stories, her childhood fascination with different cultures, her belief that building bridges was more powerful than building walls. When he spoke about Korean traditions, his voice carried warmth she'd never heard before. He told her about harvest festivals and ancestral ceremonies, about the way his grandfather had taught him calligraphy as a form of meditation, about recipes passed down through generations of women who understood that feeding people was an act of love. The wine and candlelight created a bubble of intimacy that made it easy to forget the armed guards beyond the dining room doors, the security cameras recording their every gesture. For a few hours, they were simply two people discovering an unexpected connection across cultural and circumstantial divides. It was nearly midnight when Jean appeared in the doorway, small and rumpled in Spider-Man pajamas that were delightfully ordinary amid all the formal elegance. "Bad dream," he said simply, and both adults rose simultaneously to comfort him. But it was the way Minjun automatically stepped back to let Zara gather the boy first that revealed how much had shifted during their dinner conversation. He was learning to share the burden of protecting what mattered most. As she carried Jean back to his room, she caught Minjun watching them with an expression that made her breath catch. There was hunger in his dark eyes now, carefully banked but unmistakable. Not just for her body, though that heat was certainly present, but for the peace she brought to his carefully guarded world. "Tomorrow," he said quietly as she tucked Jean back into bed, "I'd like to take you both to visit my mother. It's time she met the woman who's been teaching my son to smile again." The formal introduction to family felt like crossing a threshold they couldn't uncross. Zara nodded, acutely aware of Minjun's presence in the doorway, of the way the darkness seemed to wrap around them like a shared secret. She was falling for a dangerous man in a dangerous world, and for the first time since signing his contract, she didn't care about the consequences. The intelligence arrived on a Tuesday morning with the efficiency of a death sentence. Zara was in the garden teaching Jean to plant cherry blossom seeds when she noticed the sudden increase in security personnel, the way conversations stopped when she approached, the tension that seemed to electrify the air around the compound. Minjun found them an hour later, his expression carved from granite as he watched his son carefully pat soil around a tiny seedling. "Jean, go inside and ask Mrs. Kim to prepare your afternoon snack. I need to speak with Miss Williams privately." The boy looked between them with the sharp intuition of a child who'd learned to read dangerous undercurrents. "Appa, is everything okay?" "Everything is fine, son. Go inside now." When they were alone among the cherry trees, Minjun's controlled facade cracked enough to reveal the fury beneath. "The Yamamoto Syndicate has decided you represent an unacceptable weakness in my defenses. Intelligence suggests they're planning to eliminate both you and Jean to send a message about the consequences of interfering with their operations." The words hit her like ice water. She thought of Jin's careful seedling, his excitement about watching it grow into a tree that would outlive them all. "How long do we have?" "Hours. Maybe less. I have a car waiting to take you to the airport. You'll be on a plane to Chicago within the hour, with security provided until this situation is resolved." She turned to face him fully, noting the way he held himself like a man preparing for war. "No, this isn't a negotiation, Zara. Your life is in immediate danger. So is Jin's. You think I'm going to abandon him when he needs me most? He will be protected by the best security team money can buy. He will be terrified and traumatized again if I disappear without explanation. You can't ask me to do that to him." Minjun's jaw tightened with frustration that bordered on desperation. "I'm trying to keep you alive. These people don't issue warnings or make idle threats. They kill efficiently and without mercy. Then teach me what I need to know to help protect him instead of sending me away like excess baggage." The argument that followed was conducted in harsh whispers beneath the gentle rustling of cherry blossoms, a battle between his need to protect and her refusal to be protected at the cost of a child's emotional security. In the end, her stubborn determination won out over his practical caution. The emergency protocols were more extensive than she'd imagined. Safe rooms with independent air supplies and communication systems. Escape routes mapped through the gardens and into the surrounding neighborhood. Weapons caches hidden behind false panels and inside hollow furniture legs. If shooting starts, you take Jean to the panic room in the basement. Lock the door and don't open it for anyone except me or Officer Chim personally. If I'm dead, Chim will extract you through the tunnel system. The casual way he discussed his own death made her stomach clench with unexpected fear. "You're not going to die." His smile was sharp as broken glass. "I have no intention of dying today, but the men coming from my family won't be offered the same courtesy." She realized she'd never truly understood what Minjun was capable of until she watched him prepare for war. The elegant businessman disappeared entirely, replaced by something far more primal and infinitely more dangerous. Weapons appeared from hidden compartments with practiced efficiency. Communications equipment was tested and verified. Every contingency was planned with the precision of a military operation. Jin's birthday party was scheduled for that afternoon, a small celebration she'd insisted on despite his grandmother's protests that such frivolity was inappropriate for a boy of his position. Now the cheerful decorations felt like props in a stage play, innocent normalcy concealing the deadly currents flowing beneath. The cake was shaped like a dragon, Jin's current artistic obsession, with scales carefully piped in green and gold frosting. She'd made it herself in the compound's professional kitchen, determined to give him one perfect childhood memory amid all the careful control and constant danger. Jean blew out 8 candles with concentrated effort, his wish whispered in Korean before he explained in careful English that he'd asked for his mother to watch over them from heaven. The simple faith in his words made Zara's chest tight with emotion she couldn't name. The attack came during the gift opening, swift and coordinated and utterly without mercy. The first explosion shattered the dining room windows, sending glass and cherry blossom petals swirling through air suddenly thick with smoke and the acrid smell of high explosives. Zara's training kicked in before conscious thought could interfere. She swept Jean off his chair and beneath the reinforced table, her body covering his as automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions. "Stay down," she whispered against his ear, feeling his small body trembling with terror. "Remember what your father taught us. We go to the safe room now." The journey to the basement was 20 yards that felt like 20 miles, accomplished through a chaos of gunfire and shouted orders in multiple languages. Security personnel moved with lethal efficiency, creating protective corridors and engaging threats with weapons that turned the formal household into a battlefield. She caught glimpses of Minjun through the smoke and violence, and what she saw there froze her blood. This wasn't the controlled businessman or devoted father she'd come to know. This was apex predator made flesh, moving through combat with fluid grace that spoke of extensive training and natural instinct combined. He fired with surgical precision, each shot eliminating a threat with economical efficiency. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement, no mercy for men who dared to threaten his family. When one attacker rounded the corner near them, Minjun's response was so swift and decisive that the man was dead before his finger could find the trigger. The safe room door sealed behind them with mechanical finality, cutting off the sounds of battle above. Jean pressed himself against her side, his birthday clothes torn and stained with dust and fear. She held him close while emergency lights cast everything in hellish red, listening to the muffled explosions that shook dust from the reinforced ceiling. "It's my fault," Jean whispered in Korean, then repeated in English when she stroked his hair. "They came because of my birthday party." "No, sweetheart. They came because some people are just evil, and your father has to stop them from hurting innocent families. You didn't do anything wrong." But the guilt in his dark eyes was too familiar, too reminiscent of his father's tendency to shoulder responsibility for every threat against those he loved. She realized this child was being shaped by violence just as surely as Minjun had been, learning to see joy as vulnerability and love as liability. The silence above lasted exactly 47 minutes by the safe room's digital clock. When the door finally opened, Minjun stood there like an avenging angel dressed in tactical gear, his dark hair disheveled and a cut along his cheekbone that spoke of close-quarters combat. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. They held the cold emptiness of someone who'd done terrible things for necessary reasons, who'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed in defense of what mattered most. "It's over," he said simply, gathering his son into arms that shook almost imperceptibly with post-battle adrenaline. The compound looked like a war zone. Bullet holes stitched across walls lined with priceless art. Blood-stained marble floors that had hosted elegant dinner parties. Emergency services swarmed through rooms that would require months to restore. 7 men had attempted to breach the compound's defenses. None had survived to face questioning. Zara found Minjun an hour later in his study, sitting behind his desk like a king surveying the aftermath of conquest. He'd changed into a fresh suit, but she could still see the warrior beneath the silk tie and polished shoes. "You killed them all." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "Yes." "Does it get easier? Taking lives?" His laugh was bitter as winter wine. "I hope not. The day killing becomes easy is the day I become the monster they already think I am." She moved around his desk without conscious decision, drawn by the exhaustion in his voice and the weight he carried in those dark eyes. When she reached out to touch the cut on his cheek, he caught her wrist with reflexes still primed for violence. But his grip gentled immediately, thumb stroking across her pulse with infinite care. "You should be terrified of me," he said quietly. "You should be running as far and fast as your legs can carry you." "I should be, but I'm not." "Why?" "Because I watched you tonight. I saw what you're capable of when people threaten what you love. And I understand now that your control isn't about power. It's about making sure you never have to become that person unless there's absolutely no choice." His eyes searched her face with desperate intensity, looking for judgment or fear or disgust that simply wasn't there. "Everyone I love becomes a target, Zara. My wife died because someone wanted to hurt me. Jean was nearly kidnapped because he's my weakness. Now, they'll come for you too, again and again, until one of us is dead. Let me make sure it's not us. The kiss was inevitable as gravity, born from proximity and shared danger, and the recognition that they'd both chosen to stay in this beautiful, terrible world together. His mouth was warm and demanding against hers, tasting of desperation and relief, and the copper tang of violence survived. When they finally broke apart, his forehead rested against hers while they breathed the same air and shared the same space and acknowledged the same truth. I'm falling in love with you, he whispered like a confession torn from his soul. I'm already there, she replied, and felt his arms tighten around her like he could physically hold her safe against the storm they'd chosen to weather together. Outside the study windows, dawn was breaking over a city that didn't know how close it had come to war. But inside Minjun's arms, Zara finally understood what home was supposed to feel like. Even when home came with bulletproof glass and armed guards and the constant threat of violence from people who mistook love for weakness. She was exactly where she belonged, and no amount of danger was going to change that simple, devastating truth. The week that followed the attack passed in a strange bubble of enforced quiet, as if the compound itself was holding its breath while its inhabitants processed what survival actually meant. Jean stayed close to both of them, his small hand finding Zura's whenever uncertainty crept into his dark eyes. But his nightmares had finally stopped. There was something about surviving real danger together that had burned away his phantom fears, leaving room for genuine healing to begin. Minjun moved through the restored rooms like a man, discovering his own home for the first time. The bullet holes had been repaired, the blood scrubbed away, the priceless art rehung with museum precision. But something fundamental had shifted in the space between the walls, an intangible warmth that had nothing to do with decoration and everything to do with the woman who hummed while she cooked breakfast and the boy who laughed without looking over his shoulder first. She found the contract termination papers on her desk on a Thursday morning, elegant legal language that dissolved her employment arrangement with the efficiency of a magic spell. Her signature line waited blank beside Minjun's already completed authorization, giving her the freedom to walk away with a severance package generous enough to start over anywhere in the world. But when she looked for him to discuss the papers, she discovered him in the garden with Jean, both of them kneeling beside the cherry blossom seedling they'd planted together. The tiny tree had survived the violence with the same stubborn determination as its planters, new leaves unfurling towards spring sunshine with quiet optimism. You're releasing me from my contract, she said without preamble, holding the papers where he could see them. Minjun's hands stilled in the soil, but he didn't look up from the seedling. The arrangement was made under duress. You should have the choice to leave now that the immediate threat has passed. And if I choose to stay, then you should have better reasons than legal obligation or financial necessity. He finally met her eyes, and she saw her own reflection in those dark depths, along with something that looked dangerously like hope held in careful check. What kind of reasons would you suggest? Love, he said simply. Choice. The desire to build something together instead of simply surviving separately. Jean looked between them with the sharp awareness of a child who understood that grown-up conversations sometimes determined the entire shape of his future. His small voice cut through the garden air with devastating clarity. Are you leaving us, Miss Zara? The question hung among the cherry blossoms like a prayer awaiting an answer. Zara knelt beside him in the fresh earth, her hands covering his soil-stained fingers with infinite gentleness. That depends. Would you like me to stay? Forever, he whispered in English, then repeated it in Korean for emphasis. Forever and always. When she looked back at Minjun, she found him watching them with an expression that held 3 generations of Korean tradition warring with thoroughly modern hope. I have something for you, he said quietly, reaching into his jacket pocket. If you're interested in staying permanently. The ring box was vintage, black velvet worn soft by decades of important moments. Inside, nestled against silk that had probably cushioned similar promises for his mother and grandmother, was a ring that took her breath away. The center stone was a flawless diamond surrounded by smaller gems in a pattern that somehow managed to honor both Korean tradition and contemporary elegance. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said, his voice carrying reverence for both the jewelry and the woman who'd worn it. "She would have loved you for the way you protect what matters while refusing to be diminished by the protection you accept in return." The proposal that followed was conducted in 3 languages: Korean for tradition, English for clarity, and the wordless language of touch that needed no translation. Minjun spoke of partnership rather than possession, of building a life together that honored both their strengths instead of requiring either to sacrifice their essential nature. When she said yes, Jin's cheer echoed across the garden with pure joy, and she realized this wasn't just about joining a family, but about completing one that had been fractured by loss and held together by stubborn love. The wedding was everything Minjun's grandmother considered inappropriate, and everything that actually mattered. Instead of the formal Korean ceremony that tradition demanded, they chose the community center where Zara had worked, transforming the humble space into something magical with cherry blossoms from the compound's gardens and tables laden with food that bridged both their cultures. Jean served as ring bearer with solemn pride, carrying the symbols of their commitment down an aisle lined with people whose lives Zara had touched through her work. Korean elders sat beside refugee families, sharing stories in broken English, while children played between the folding chairs with the universal language of laughter. Minjun's security team provided discreet protection from the shadows, but for once their vigilance felt like guardianship rather than imprisonment. This wasn't a man displaying his possession, but a partner celebrating the choice they'd made to face whatever came next together. When the officiant asked if she took this man to be her husband, knowing full well the dangers that came with loving someone whose enemies viewed kindness as weakness, Zara's voice carried across the community center with absolute certainty. "I do." The reception stretched late into the evening, filled with music that ranged from traditional Korean folk songs to contemporary R&B that had Jean showing off dance moves he'd learned from YouTube. Zara found herself thinking about the woman in the photograph Minjun still carried, wondering if Soo-jin would have approved of the joy flooding back into her husband's dark eyes. As if summoned by her thoughts, Minjun appeared beside her with 2 glasses of champagne and an expression that suggested he'd been following similar mental pathways. "She would have liked you," he said quietly, understanding her unspoken question. Soo-jin always believed that love multiplies rather than divides, that there was room in any heart for multiple kinds of devotion. "I hope I can honor her memory by loving you both well." "You already do. Every day." The evening's final surprise came when Jean approached them with a carefully wrapped package, his small face serious with the weight of importance. "I made this for you," he announced in English that had grown confident through months of practice. "It's a family picture." The drawing inside showed 3 figures standing beneath a cherry tree in full bloom, their faces bright with smiles and their hands linked together in an unbroken chain. Above them, a 4th figure with flowing hair and gentle eyes watched from fluffy clouds, her expression peaceful and approving. Jean said softly, pointing to Zara's figure in the drawing. "That's you now. My new Uma." The Korean word for mother hit her like a physical blow, carrying weight that legal documents and wedding ceremonies could never match. This was Jin's choice to claim her just as completely as she'd chosen to claim him, creating bonds that existed beyond blood or circumstance. When she looked up through tears she hadn't realized were falling, she found Minjun watching them both with wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe that happiness was allowed to exist in their carefully guarded world. 6 months later, their morning routine had settled into rhythms that felt as natural as breathing. Zara woke first, padding downstairs in bare feet to start coffee and prepare Jin's lunch for school. Minjun appeared next, impeccably dressed for business, but never too rushed to help their son tie shoes or review spelling words. Jean had grown 3 inches and gained confidence in equal measure, his laughter echoing through rooms that had once felt like museums. He drew constantly now, filling sketchbooks with stories of dragons and heroes, families and adventures, all featuring characters who looked remarkably like the 3 people who'd learned to love each other through choice rather than circumstance. The external threats had never completely disappeared, but they'd evolved into manageable challenges rather than constant crises. Minjun's reputation for absolute protection had actually enhanced his family's safety, sending clear messages to potential enemies about the consequences of targeting people under his care. This particular morning found them gathered around the kitchen table while rain drummed against windows, and Jean worked on a drawing that seemed to require unusual concentration. "What are you creating today, artist?" Minjun asked, settling into his chair with coffee and the morning newspapers. "Our story," Jean replied seriously. "The whole thing, from when saved me to when we became a real family." Zara looked over his shoulder at the elaborate comic book he'd been working on for weeks, complete with panels showing each major moment of their unlikely journey. There she was, baseball bat raised in defense of a frightened child. There was Minjun, surrounded by security and power, but clearly lonely until they'd entered his life. And there was Jean himself, growing stronger and happier as the pages progressed. The final panel showed all three of them together in the garden, planting cherry trees that would grow alongside their family for decades to come. "You know what I learned?" Zara said, settling into her own chair and accepting the coffee Minjun offered with the automatic courtesy that had become second nature. "I thought I was saving one little boy from danger that night. But really, that little boy saved me right back." "How?" Jean asked, looking up from his artwork with genuine curiosity. "He showed me what it meant to be part of something bigger than myself. He taught me that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose, and that love doesn't always look like what you expect it to look like." Minjun's hand found hers across the table, their fingers intertwining with the same natural ease that had marked their connection from the beginning. "You made us whole," he said quietly, his dark eyes holding depths of gratitude and devotion that still took her breath away. "Both of us. We were surviving before you arrived, but we weren't truly living." Outside the kitchen windows, the cherry trees they'd planted together were beginning to bud, promising another spring in a garden that had learned to bloom despite the walls built around it. Inside, a family born from crisis and choice continued the quiet work of loving each other through whatever storms might come. Jean added one final touch to his drawing, a small heart floating above the three figures like a blessing. When he looked up, his smile carried all the confidence of a child who'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous people could also be the safest harbor, and that love strong enough to survive anything was worth whatever risks it required. "What story should we imagine together next?" Zara asked as she traced the outline of that drawn heart with one finger. "I have so many ideas," Jean said seriously, "but they all have happy endings. And somewhere in that promise of infinite stories yet to be told, in the certainty of a love that had transformed captivity into sanctuary and danger into devotion, Zara understood that some fairy tales were worth fighting for. Even when they came with bulletproof glass and armed guards, and the constant knowledge that happily ever after sometimes required more courage than any princess had ever needed to find. But looking at her husband and son, her chosen family gathered around a simple kitchen table while the rain fell softly outside and the future stretched ahead like pages waiting to be filled, she wouldn't trade a single dangerous, beautiful moment of the life they'd built together. Some cages, she'd learned, were really sanctuaries in disguise, and some happy endings were worth every risk it took to claim them.